Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Hi. Justin, is it okay if we start? A personal invite to Justin to join the group. Yeah, so welcome to the OAUTH session, and this is the first of 3 sessions, so we have a lot of material, which is fantastic. We have, as you will see later, a bunch of good presentations lined up. Rifat for this meeting is online. Rifat, say hello to the group.
Hello, everyone, from snowy Ottawa.
Yeah. Greetings back from humid Brisbane. And I know it because I walked over here and changed my shirt. Rifat, do you actually want us to walk us through the first slides before we hand it over to the actual speakers?
Sure. Okay, welcome everyone. As you probably noticed, we have a new area director. So I don't know if Deb is in the room. So, and
No,
first we want to. Is she?
She's not in the room. No.
Okay. Well, we have a new area director, and so we want to first thank Rowan for all his help and his leadership in helping us with many things around with his great support for the OAUTH work group. So thank you, Roman. I appreciate your help and congratulations on your new role. Awesome. Next slide.
So
Yeah,
can I add something kind of riff out about that, the transition, since Deb isn't on the call? So first, you are in much better hands now that you have Deb. So things should be running kind of even better. Because I'm staying on the ISG, we're going to do something a little bit different transition-wise. Typically, when you do the AD handoff, all the documents would disappear from the outgoing AD and drop into the queue of the new incoming AD. And historically, that introduces a bit of delay because there's a spin-up time for the new AD. I've already negotiated with Deb to keep document velocity. Everything that's in my queue is going to stay, that's past PubRec is going to stay with me, and I'm going to drive it to completion. And hopefully that would take out the typically 4 to 6 or 7 week delay that would get introduced. So everything that's still with me after kind of PubRec, there's kind of 2 documents, I'm going to drive it to conclusion. So.
Great, thanks, Roman. Okay, next slide, Hannes. Okay, there's a delay here. Okay, this is the note well. So hopefully you're familiar with this already. This governs everything that we do at the IETF. So if you're not familiar with it, please make sure you're familiar with it. Next slide, please. These are tips. Hopefully you're already familiar with those. If you are in person, use the light version. If you are remote, use the full version and make sure you're on mute unless you want to speak. Next slide, please.
Yeah, please use the QR code to log in so we have the accurate count of the participants in the room. And
yep. Awesome.
That's something I can't tell you. Oh, okay. Excellent. Cool.
If you go to the agenda, you can also, the agenda online, you can also get to the on-site tool from there. There's a link.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, next slide. Okay, a quick update. We have the security BCP, I think very close to like, in publication requested, but I don't know, Roman, do you have an update on that? Like what's the latest there?
No, the security BCP is much further down the document kind of pipeline.
Right.
It's waiting for some revisions before I can bring it to the ISG.
Awesome. Perfect. And the other document is just waiting for the BCP. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Next. Okay. Today we have, obviously we have 3 sessions for today. We have, Brian will start us with talking about SDJOT. Mike and Aaron will be talking about resource metadata. Aaron will be talking about browser-based apps. George will be talking about transaction token. Kelly will be talking about identity chaining, and Aaron will be talking about identity assertion authorization graph. This is kind of a new draft. This is we had to shuffle a few things, so that's the reason this ended up here. So that's for today. Next slide, please. For Thursday, SDJOT VC. I think Oliver is going to drive this. A token status list. After that, attestation-based client authentication. Non-endpoint status attestation by Ori. And we added kind of a new draft that we just wanted to give people a chance to speak to the OAuth work group for a new idea that they want to kind of discuss. So we give them a spot at the end of this slot, at the 10-minute slot there. And Friday, next slide, please. So Peter will start with cross-device flow BCP. Aaron will give a quick update on 2.1. Dean and Sarah will be talking about CEDAR profile for RAR. George will be talking about first-party apps. And Aaron will be talking about global token revocation. And another addition to this is, again, signed JWK set by Richard Barnes. He wanted to talk about this. He sent an email to the list, I think. So that's our agenda. Any questions, comments about the agenda? Any agenda bash? If not, I think I would like Brian to get started here. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Rifat, and also a welcome to the online participants. I see that we have a large number of folks, so thanks for joining, and maybe inconvenient for some of you. Completely realize that. How are we doing? I do it for me. I click it.
Okay. All right. Good morning, Wednesday morning, everybody. I get to kick things off here, which is fun. Talk about selective disclosure for JWT, SDJOT, on behalf of myself and Daniel and Christina, who are remote, I think, or they're definitely not here, but I believe they're joining us remote. So, customary photograph of the location. And with that, let's go on to the next slide. So quick rough agenda here. I want to complain a little bit about jet lag and the time zones. I know I'm not the only one, and I know it's Wednesday and I should be over it, but I'm not. So my brain is a little foggy and slow. If I freeze up here, Mitch McConnell style, that's why. Bear with me a little bit. What too soon? Oh, well, there were a few laughs. I'm going to give a briefish overview, refresher of what this thing is. It's always hard here to sort of cater to the room-to-room tourists and the people that have been following overview. So I'm going to try really hard to give enough context to be meaningful for people that aren't familiar with the work and not too much to bore the rest of you. Go over changes since the last time we met, or as Mike likes to say, since our heroes last met. Talk a little bit about the open issues and questions, and take a closer look at just a couple of those. And that's the extent of what I've got today. Could I have the next slide, please? So rough overview, SDJOT is a salted hash-based mechanism for selective disclosure of individual elements of a JSON object used as the payload of a JSON web signature structure. That's a lot of words. Mainly, this is about, SDJOT is about selective disclosure for JWT claims, so that you can issue a JWT with a bunch of different claims in it, and the holder of that JWT can present it and select from the set of claims which ones they actually want to reveal in the context of that presentation. There's been a lot of talk about things recently, various formats and so forth. I wanted to reiterate here that one of the main aims of SDJOT is to be easy to implement and understand, leveraging familiar, established, and widely used data formats and cryptographic algorithms, those being those in JWS, JWT, stuff that's used predominantly everywhere. Everywhere is a big for widely used out there. There's lots of developer familiarity. There's lots of deployments. So this is really meant to be a easy to use, easy to implement incremental step on top of existing functionality, not a completely new concept. Next slide, please.
Here's the clicker. It works.
Thank you, Hannes. So real quick example of an SD JOT we have here. The first three parts, they're color coded, show a regular old-fashioned JOT JWS. You have the header, the payload, the signature, all base64 encoded, and SD JOT unique functionality here is this last part where there's a series of base64 URL encoded things, tilde separated, tacked onto the end. We'll look at the insides of this a little bit. That works. Inside of the payload, there is this SD claim that is an array, and this can operate at various levels within the content area, but I'm just showing at the main level. It's an array of hashes, digest values, each of which is the digest over one of these disclosure objects. So it both maps to the disclosure, references it, and ensures the integrity of the disclosure because it's signed underneath the payload and is a hash of that disclosure. So each one of these points to one of the disclosures, each of which shown here decoded, has a salt value, the actual claim name, and the value of the claim. The salt's there to sort of prevent brute force hash recovery of the values, and so you couldn't, if there's like a claim value and name value that has a small space, you couldn't brute force those values into the hash and sort of reverse the hash to figure out what the value of the actual claims are, which would undermine the value of this. Jet lag's kicking in, I'm losing my train of thought. Anyway, that's the main idea how it works. So you see the main structure in here, you have the hashes, they reference these disclosures outside of it. The whole thing then, this is what a holder would receive from an issuer, and when it goes to present that, say the holder only wants to reveal their birth date. So they take the original SD JOT, pull off all the other disclosures, and just tack that one last one onto the end. So that still, the signature still verifies, the integrity of all this is still maintained, but the actual presentation to the verifier here only reveals the one claim value that's disclosed in this last piece, which is the birth date. We also have the concept of a key binding JOT, which is an additional JWT you can tack on to the end of the entire SD JOT structure that proves possession of a key held encoded within the JOT itself using like the CNF claim. So a public key can be encoded inside the main body of the JWT. And this SD or the KB JOT can be appended to the end, includes things like an audience and a hash, audience and a nonce that provided by the verifier somewhere, and it can prove possession of the key inside of the payload with respect to this particular presentation. It also includes this SD hash claim, which is a hash value over the preceding rest of the SD JOT content itself, which sort of ensures the integrity from the holder's perspective of which claim, which disclosures were intended to be presented. So since we last met in Prague, we've published 2 revisions, 7 and 8. What's new in 7? It's a variety of things. We now reference our RFC 4086 in the security considerations about salt entropy. It's basically just an actual reference to saying that random number generation is hard. Here's some advice about how to do it. Neil Madden suggested we make this reference. I think it's worthwhile to have. Did some IANA stuff that's largely unconsequential, but they reached out to us and made the suggestion, so we did it. We strengthened the security considerations around what claims, or basically not making claims which control the validity of the JOT itself, selectively disclosable. So there's stronger text in there now saying that you can't make things like expiration or the confirmation claim selectively disclosable, because then you put into the hands of the holder the ability to disclose or not disclose things that would be relevant to the security context of presenting the SD JOT itself. So we're saying, you can't make those selectively disclosable. They have to be in the main body of the document, while also saying that the verifier should have policy around what claims they expect always, so that they're not subject to potentially a mistake here and selectively disclosable claims being withheld that might affect security that if they were presented would make it invalid. If they're not presented, it would somehow let through. The policy on the verifier side needs to be static to avoid those sorts of mistaken, not attacks, but mistakenly accepting things that their policy wouldn't otherwise allow for. There was a little bit of ambiguity around what to do if you encounter duplicate digest values in the body of the document, if those were at different levels or whatever. Basically, it's been clarified to say that if you find any duplicate digests within the context of the payload itself or any recursive inclusion through the document, that needs to be rejected. It's invalid. And that if there are any unused digests that were included on the unused disclosures, included on the outside of the document that weren't referenced from the inside, then that too is, basically if there's any left over, that too is an error condition, needs to be rejected. There were some questions around sort of the edge cases that's come up in various formats, edge cases around the tilde separated formats. We've tried to be very clear about cases, how that's used when there's no disclosures, when there's no KB jot. It just better illustrated and gave examples thereof. And we did change the claim name of the hash that I was speaking about previously, the hash over the prior SD-jot content with the disclosures that's presented inside the KB jot. We changed it from underscore SD hash just to SD hash. And that's a small change, but it is breaking in that it changes the claim name. Although the prior one had only been published for one draft, this is a small update. We tried to do it quickly. And it's really just to sort of align name usage with context, and the underscore didn't really make sense in the context of the KB jot, where we've used it to sort of help differentiate claim names in the actual payload content of the SD jot. This is just sort of a change to align things a little bit better. There I am, jet lag rambling again. Hopefully that makes sense. In 8, marked a couple of RFCs normative. They were informative, just sort of mistakes. Trying to be a bit more prescriptive about suggesting the use of the CNF JWK confirmation claim method to be used to convey the key binding key. So it still is not required to do that, but we're more strongly stating that if you're going to do key binding, this is probably the way you want to do it, using the RFC 7800 CNF with the JWK method in it, basically encoding the entire public key within the contents using the CNF claim. Some editorial changes, some reviewers came in and just noted some things that could use some clarification. We tried to accommodate that. Daniel rewrote and expanded on the unlinkability considerations in the privacy section. I think really did a nice job of further explaining what unlinkability means, in which context, what SD-jot can provide and can't provide, and various different ways of its usage to be very clear about what is and isn't possible there. And in the course of that, also mentioned rather clearly that the key binding key is potentially a correlation handle, which I think was largely obvious to a lot of people, but it kept coming up in various conversations as though people were just discovering it for the first time. So we tried to be very clear just on the outset, at least say it in the content of the document, so it wasn't as much of a surprise. We removed the entire mention of unspecified key binding methods. There was a lot of sort of hand-wavy text in various places that were saying, if you wanted to do key binding proof by some other mechanism, great, do it here. It didn't really add anything because it's still possible to do that, but these sort of unactionable callouts in the document were maybe a little bit distracting and encouraging things that we didn't necessarily want to encourage. And in the course of that, also removed this entire section on enveloping SD-jots that was also non-normative, but just showing a bunch of examples of saying like, well, you could sign this, put this inside of this and sign this. None of which now is prohibited, but we're just not going out of our way to sort of show examples of possibilities of things that aren't normative or interoperable anyway. There were some editorial updates aimed at a little bit better consistent treatment of disclosure, which is the whole base64 URL encoded piece versus the contents of the disclosure inside it. There was some text that wasn't totally clear on that. Hopefully it's better use of the terminology now. And missed something here, but updated the Oh yeah, sorry. Updated the PID example, which is the personal information document out of the EU. There's an example in there that's evolving as the EU stuff evolves, and this hopefully more closely tracks kind of where the current thinking and direction of that is going. We've, in concurrence with those examples, we've tried to be a lot more explicit that that example, as well as the one that references the W3C VC data model, are only examples of what you might be able to do using SDJOT applied to these sort of data formats. They're not normative in any way. They're not actually defining anything, just suggesting that you could do something like this. Trying to be really clear, though, that it's not actually a normative definition, even though it's in an appendix and an example, just trying to be more clear.
Can you do it?
A lot of the aforementioned changes were driven by reviews, suggestions, and so forth by various people. Try to say thank you. I won't cover all of them. Richard Barnes, thanks in the back. Rohan, thank you very much. I know Neil, probably not online, but he made a lot of comments around the last IETF that helped us really tighten up some of the recommendations and wording around cryptography and hashing. I'll probably forget some others, but just wanted to acknowledge the acknowledgements here. And then take a look at some open issues. So really useful screenshot of GitHub here, but try to just discuss a few of these. We'll talk about this a little bit more in just a slide, but looking at redesigning the JWS JSON serialization. Richard suggested providing some ABNF around the format itself, and then in the course of that suggestion provided some ABNF that was neither syntactically nor semantically valid. We thought about that a little bit, but I think we have something now that is both and would be easy to include. So that's out there, but we haven't gotten to it yet. Richard, again, noted that the JWS serialization as it exists now doesn't have anything and doesn't cover anything about key binding. This was actually an intentional removal in a prior draft because of some fluctuation and some oddities around the JWS serialization that we're trying to deal with, but is likely to be put back in a slightly different context. Talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Editorial stuff about section headings. Richard, again, has suggested some improvements maybe to some of the diagrams. That stuff now is actually pretty far out of date, and maybe we could chat about that sometime this week and see where we could take some of that. There's a lot there. Some of it may be useful. Some of it needs to be aligned. Richard, again, has suggested that we have a separate token and presentation format. This in particular is both only a terminology change, but also a relatively significant change. And I have a whole slide dedicated to this we'll talk about shortly. Clarifying the algorithms to accommodate recursive redaction. So there's this concept that disclosures can be nested within disclosures, that the hash can reference another disclosure and they can be recursive, which allows for redaction or selective disclosure at multiple layers. Richard, you had an action item here to review and suggest changes around clarification a couple months ago. I think maybe you've forgotten about it. But if you have some clarifications, it would be nice to get those in. So subtle reminder. Okay, yeah, it's it would be just editorial clarification. I think it's just sitting out there. I think Nat suggested we have a formal section on abbreviations. I'll go back to Richard.
So just on recursive redaction briefly, I think it may not be just editorial. I think the algorithm for processing an SDJOT and disclosing what's disclosed, I think that's correct. What I think is missing is for discussions on how you correctly choose what to disclose and not, because if you're gonna if you've got a chain of recursive redactions, you're going to remove something at the middle. You need to make sure that you remove stuff down at the end, or else you end up with the new stricter validation rules. You end up with an invalid.
With an invalid, yeah. So around the holders choosing which to disclose under the context of
that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Nat wanted abbreviations. I think these are maybe actually covered in another PR, but we'll do that. And then this is a weird sounding one, but presentation is capitalized as though it's a defined term, but it's not actually in a definition. There is an open PR, which is why it's noted here that unrelated to this changes this and sort of treats it more as a non-special defined term and just uses it in the context of its actual meaning.
Brian, just a reminder, we are running out of time, okay? So.
Okay, I'll go quickly. So on separating the formats, Richard's thesis here is that SD-JOT itself provides different security properties both with and without a KB-JOT or without KB binding. And the verifier really needs to know which it expects or else, and I feel like this is a bit hyperbolic, but in some senses somewhat real, you're gonna get things like algorithm type vulnerabilities where the KB-JOT is stripped and somebody would accept it without knowing their policy that they shouldn't be. You can do different things with this, both with and without KB. So we should talk about them in completely different things. PR 394 introduces and uses this distinction, which is a selectively disclosable JOT, which is everything up to the key binding, the issuer signed JOT, and the disclosures. That's always an SD-JOT, period. And a selectively disclosable JOT with key binding or SD-JOT-KB. This PR has been out there for a while. We've gone through a lot of iterations back and forth on it. And with my editor hat on, I feel like it's looking pretty good to proceed after iterating on it back and forth. I started writing this log a long time ago and thought maybe I'd bring it here and put it in forward to the working group and get enough pushback to tell Richard to go away, but I think it's actually flipping the other way. So we could use some productive input on it. If you want to take a look, give it a look over. But at this point, I think it's something we're going to look to proceed with, sort of barring major objections out there from the working group, because I think it helped clarifies and improve things. And of course, there is still a little bit of bike shedding, what we're going to call this. It was originally FNORD. We've got the dash, we've got the plus, we've got the tilde, which I think is cute and nice, but there's some need for agreement on it. I think the dash or the plus would be good, but bike shedding is always hard to get to agreement, but input is welcome here.
There's Peter in the queue.
So running low on time, can I finish the last slide and come back to Peter?
Okay, but cut the sort of the rumbling short.
I'll try. We're looking to revisit the JWS JSON serialization again. Despite being logical, what we have in there, the current JWS JSON serialization approach is not well suited for existing JDAS implementations in the EU digital identity context. So what needs to happen to facilitate this is update such that the disclosures and the KB-JOT go into the unprotected header and then describe how to use those to construct the input into the KB-JOT's SD hash. There's a PR out for this that's outstanding, and basically it looks like these two things here, basically just including those things within the JSON serialization inside of the header. And in the case where there's multiple signatures in the JWS serialization, the general serialization, only using the first signature element to construct those things. That's out there. And then looking at next steps, there's obviously some impending changes, but the main format and processing have been really largely stable for quite a while now. There's a growing number of independent open source implementations available. And this is referenced by a variety of other specs, frameworks, profiles and foundations, et cetera. We are obviously not ready for working group last call right now, but I think that we are getting pretty close. So looking forward to IETF 120 in Vancouver, which is the photograph here, and I will stop rambling now, and we have a queue, starting with Peter.
Peter.
Hi, this is Peter Chunchi Liu from Huawei. It's actually happening in the chat, so it's starting a thread already, so it's more like a comment than a question. So actually, when you go back to the claims, so when this first attracts me, it actually has a very good use case of the digital driver's license, where you can compare your age to a legal threshold. So in here, like the question I have is that, do you have like an algebraic comparison capability to the age of your claim right here? And the answer I have in the chat is no. You either disclose it, or you have another claim that is age over 18 or something. It's just it's more like a comment. So because this is a very nice use case that attracts me, and I think it could make sense if you address those, either add a claim or add some fancy crypto, zero knowledge crypto, but that sounds like overkill. Well, either way, maybe that's, address that maybe, and that would be a great use case too.
So you're right, there's not zero knowledge crypto, there's not anything fancy like this. Right now you can include a claim like this, expose the whole birth date, or one of the examples actually shows something more granular, which is the age over, and with a couple of different entries for age over 18, 21, whatever. And you could then selectively disclose one of those or the appropriate one of those in the context. And in terms of the scope and complexity of this specification, that's as far as this is going to define. So that the latter one would probably be the functionality that you would look to employ, I think.
Right. There's a granularity of the privacy that you can consider.
Yeah, and it's trade-offs.
Okay, so, sorry guys. Brian, thank you. I think we're way over time, and I know we've locked that queue already. So we apologize for the people that were waiting in the queue. So we have to cut it here and go to the next presentation. Thank you, Brian.
But in general, for future presentations, like make sure that you leave enough time at the end for actual discussion.
Yeah.
So we can actually cover
while we're
that as
switching
well.
over, though, I'm just going to say a quick thank you to the authors. I obviously shipped a ton of issues at you, and you've been good to work with. So thanks for working through that.
Thanks for the detailed reviews, Richard.
Am I advancing my own slides, or are you doing?
You can use the clicker.
Good morning. I'm Mike Jones. Thank you for all being here today. And I will be updating the working group on the status of the protected resource metadata specification. And taking a page out of Brian Campbell's playbook, this is one of my photographs from this week. It's not working next.
Oh, okay. I'll do it.
So in the last couple working group meetings at IETFs, I've talked about what is this for and what does it do? I am not going to do that. If you want to read that, rewind 4 months and look at the presentation from the last time in Prague. Next. So what's happened since IETF 18? We switched from concatenating .wellknown to the end of the URL to the awkward sticking it in the middle before the path, after the host, which is what the well-known RFC and Mark Nottingham insist that we do. So we've done that. That way we won't get stopped at IESG review, etc. And we had to do this with the AS metadata, even though it's a terribly awkward construction. We changed to have the www authenticate return the URL from which you can fetch the metadata, as opposed to returning the resource identifier. This was based on working group feedback, both at the previous meeting and in subsequent discussions on the list. So that's done. And Philippe Skokum, as he does, found a bug and we corrected it. That takes us to an interesting point, which is every issue that's been filed against the spec has been addressed, and we know of no others that are outstanding. Therefore, cutting to the chase, is it time for working group last call?
So, does anyone in the room or online have an opinion about whether this is ready? Are there any new open issues or other comments, because if not, we would just start a working group last call after the end of the meeting. Don't hear anything, so I think just in recording the meeting that we should start a working group last call on this. Oh, Christina. Okay. Oh, okay. If you
Yeah.
strengthen the working group last call, then go ahead.
How much implementation experience is there for this draft?
All of the OpenID Federation implementations use it. So there's at least 4 or 5.
So this became mandatory in OpenID Federation spec?
It is. It always has been.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Atul?
Yeah, just a note that even the OpenID shared signals framework will use this. It doesn't need it, but it's something that will benefit from it. And I'm not opposed to the last call. I'm just sort of wanting to make a comment that this makes it possible for a resource server to get a token that is far more capable than what it might need, and it might lead to token abuse. And I kind of discussed this, and I realized this is not a problem with this particular spec, but it's an issue that I think we should think about.
Okay. So, yeah, do we have a few reviewers? Atul, would you be willing to do a review in a working group last call?
Yes, I will.
Any other show of hands, people who commit their time after the IETF meeting to do a review as well? Peter, I see Peter's hand. Monty? Okay, so we at least have 3 or 4.
You have Philip in the queue too.
Perfect.
Just raising my hand.
Okay, Philip is raising his hand as well. Excellent, that's very good. So Rifat and I will get together, issue a working group last call, decide about the Shepherd and get it done. Thanks, Mike.
You can have the rest of my time back.
Brian will be thankful. So we have the browser-based apps on the agenda next. Well,
that's me. You can give me slide control.
You ran so much overtime, so you have eaten up it. But if there's time left, Brian will definitely get to those. Oh, no, it's perfect. Perfect. Aaron.
Great. Can you hand me the slides?
If I figure out how to do that.
Can you request control for the slides? Oh,
Well, I think I just did.
How does it work?
it's supposed to come up in a dialog.
Can you do it again?
Yeah, can you do it again?
Yeah. It says ask slides. Is that the button?
If you click on his face and right click over the 3 dots, one of the options should be to give him control.
Aaron, we'll flip slides. Can you please just say
Okay.
next slide, please?
Great. Okay, welcome. Sorry I couldn't be there, but this is a photo I took in Brisbane last time I was there. So I wanted to give an update on this draft. It's been making some pretty good progress. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm sure we're all familiar with this by now, but the premise of the draft is to include recommendations for people who are building apps that are executing in a browser, also known as single page apps. And that includes both with and without a backend component of the application. Next slide. The latest significant changes in the draft have been a major restructuring of this. A lot of this was thanks to Philippe Dirick And this is an excerpt of the table of contents in the new structure. Basically, we're going through now a list of threats to JavaScript apps and describing the different types of attacks and what happens if those attacks are successful. And then next slide. Then going through different patterns for building apps and describing which of those patterns solve which of the attacks. Some of them solve more attacks than others. Next slide. So the BFF pattern backend for front end, we can see that this section talks about the relevant attack scenario, and this is just proxying requests via the user's browser. So if an attacker can get into the app, they can't steal tokens, but they can proxy requests because no tokens are in the front end in this scenario. And this now references the other sections that talk about the threats. Next slide. We go through this with the other patterns as well. So this is the pattern of a backend that coordinates the acquisition of tokens. And now you can see we've got a few more different attacks that are possible. So it is now possible to extract a access token as well as proxying requests. And that means we can use stolen access tokens. Go to next slide. And the third pattern being a pure browser-based OAuth client. This one has the most attacks and consequences of those attacks because of just the inability for a pure browser-based client to have a lot of the protection mechanisms that the other patterns have. But overall, the goal of this draft is not to say that any one of these is the best option. It's to point out the relevant attacks and consequences that are in each pattern. Next slide. So from the last time we met, we had some great reviews from Philip and Lewis. So a lot of those changes are now incorporated. There was some clarifications on what it means to use cookie encryption in this context. And there's a new security consideration regarding the use of post message, which also references the security BCP, which also mentioned post message. Next slide. So at this point, there are no open issues. We've addressed all the feedback that we've gotten. There's been, I don't know if you saw, but there's been a couple of emails on the list over the last couple of days, but we've addressed those comments. It didn't seem like there was anything new brought up in those emails. It was all stuff that had already been captured in the draft. So we believe that there isn't anything left to do on this and would like to suggest moving this to working group last call.
Thanks, Aaron. That's fantastic. So it's my question similar to the previous presentation from Mike. Is anyone objecting to us issuing a working group last call on this document? Doesn't Justin?
To be clear, I'm not objecting. I have some comments. As I'm sure you saw on the list, I did a full read through of the document and had a lot of comments on the text. I do want to emphasize that my comments on the text are all around making what's in there clearer. So there are parts that definitely felt like, oh, this is a piece of text that used to be before something else and now it's after, and so the antecedents don't line up and blah, blah, blah. And I think that going through and sweeping out a lot of that kind of editorial debris will vastly improve the readability of the document. But I really have no objection to it going to last call, even in its current state, because the kind of comments that I was giving, that's the kind of stuff that you would want to come up in last call anyway. It's like, this is what we meant. It doesn't quite say that. Here's how you might be able to say that kinds of thing. Overall, I do think it is a strong document. I think it's a very needed document out there. I've been throwing people at this draft for years now. This is basically a long-winded way of saying, despite the 7 pages of notes that I put on the list of things that need to be fixed, I still support it going to working group last call because I fully trust the editors to be able to address those bits.
Thanks, Justin, and
Great.
thanks for the detailed review. I didn't notice it on the list, but yeah, I recently read through the document myself, so I'm also convinced that it's a strong document. And so let's issue a working group last call. I consider your review, Justin, as the first one, and there would be others as well. So could I have a few show of hands for people who want to or commit time to review the document, so we have some good working group last call comments? I think it's a really important document. It's one of our sort of like
I will speak up
typical usage environment.
for, I'll speak up for a coworker of mine who was actually at the last meeting, and he offered to read through it and submit comments. And he is still planning on submitting them, so you can include his review in that as well.
What's his name?
That's Andy.
Andy.
And
Andy
Tim
Barlow.
spoke up on
Tim
Jabber.
also,
Thanks.
yeah, there you go.
Just a clarifying question for the notes, since Aaron mentioned that stuff has been fixed in the editor's draft, or at least it sounded like that. Should we, is that in a state that should be published as a -18 to officially kick that off, or do we want to stick with 17 for the review? This is a question to the editors and the chairs.
Oh, sorry. No, there's the draft 17 is the latest. There's nothing in the editor's draft right now. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so we have Justin's review, we have Tim, and we have Andy doing a review. So that's a good start. And of course, Rifat and I will do a review as well as part of the shepherding process. Okay, excellent. We'll do that also after the IETF meeting, maybe a little bit space so we don't overwhelm the group. Perfect. Next presentation, transaction tokens. It should.
Inconsistent.
Yeah.
It's inconsistent.
Yeah. It's
All right. Where's my thing? Okay. So ubiquitous photo from Tuesday morning. All right. So just give a high-level overview. Transaction tokens. It's the goal here is how do you manage basically authorization and transaction immutability within a trust domain boundary. I talked about this in a lot more detail at the Whimsy working group on Monday. But basically a transaction token contains like who the transaction's about, that's an entity, it doesn't have to be a human. What is the context, both request context or other context about the transaction, and whatever sort of details about the transaction that you want to be immutable. Most of this is driven by the fact that in most of our deployments, it takes multiple workloads to complete a transaction. And so because of that, you want to basically ensure the integrity of that transaction as it transitions between multiple workloads. And I will say in the vast majority of backends that I've seen, the best I've seen is basically machine-to-machine authentication, right? Like MTLS. So this machine's allowed to call that machine to invoke an API, but the details of the APIs being invoked tend to be specific. So, I mean, tend to be replay, or if you compromise the internal machine, you could change the parameter values and hence this gives you a little bit better movement towards zero trust. Okay. So I'm going to run through all of these. This is pretty much the changes to the spec since draft 01 that was published for IETF 118. The main piece here is that we had originally started using the sub ID out of the set structure, and we moved back to using just a standard subclaim.
Unlike OpenID Connect, where the subclaim is bound to the issuer, in transaction tokens, the subclaim is bound to the authorization domain, which is identified by the audience claim. And then we also, we'll talk about next, the specification allows for some intermediate workload to request what we're calling a replacement transaction token. And in that process, you want to be able to know who requested the replacement transaction token along with the originating entity or workload that requested the original transaction token. So we added some logic in here. The main piece here in this we can discuss is, we basically just said that the requesting workload, which is a claim inside the context structure, can be a single value if there's just one, but if there's more than one, it's like XFF. We just append the requesting workload to the end of the array. And so it's not, this is not explicitly not a path of all the workloads the transaction has has passed through. I think we should do that in a way that's outside the transaction token. And we need to probably look at that separately. But again, this is an area that is up for discussion. There are some questions about, can transaction tokens only be used when you're crossing the trust domain boundaries between external and inside your perimeter? And the answer to that is no. So we clarified that. We clarified how subject token and subject token type, which are required parameters in the token exchange, can be leveraged in an internal call. Brian had provided a lot of feedback around how we weren't profiling it well. So a lot of these changes sort of came back out of that. Added a section for the transaction token service itself on processing rules for when a request comes in for a new transaction token, things it needs to do, like the requesting workload needs to be authenticated. You have to validate the subject token, and then giving the transaction token service authorization privilege for making decisions about what kinds of claims go in what places when it issues, right? Because you could have a case where requesting workload tries to ask for a transaction token for a particular purpose, and it's not authorized to do that, in which case it should be rejected. Again, more clarifications around token exchange and specifying a specific type for the issued token type. When you're requesting a replacement transaction token, some additional processing rules that you can't change the sub and you can't change the audience. And then, as we said before, what happens to the workload that's requesting the replacement transaction token? How is that included in the resulting transaction token so a downstream service could process it correctly? We added a section on how do you pass a transaction token between servers. And basically we sort of hand waved here. So this is another key point of discussion. Should we define a whole new HTTP header for this? Should we, whatever? So we just basically said, for now, it goes in an HTTP header, but we didn't make any specifics about what HTTP header or what it should be named or any of those kinds of things. I'm pretty sure, Brian, it's not in there. So this is something that that we need to discuss, on the list, hopefully, if you, how we want to do this. I'm gonna come back to something else that sort of touches on this, but that's a big open area. So I think out of this slide deck here, the two things are, how do we sort of track the set of workloads that requested new replacement transaction tokens? That's kind of new work here rather than just clarifications and tightening things up. And then this one on how do you present a transaction token? Dean, can I wait until I'm done? I think I've got just a couple and we got time. Updated security considerations around some thoughts around actor token and actor token type, which are part of token exchange, which could be used for client authentication, though I don't think most people would. So a little bit of work there. And then basically put how the requesting workload authenticates is out of scope for this particular spec, right? There's many ways that could happen. Okay, I wanted, and I should have taken a page out of Brian's book about copying the issues list. There are 2 issues in the OAuth GitHub site for transaction tokens that I think are also important. One of them has to do with how do you use a transaction token in some sort of long-running batch request. In the past, I've seen this in the context of, GDPR user says delete my data. So the user identity store gets deleted, but I need to keep the identifier for the user around long enough to clean up all their data, right? As that sort of propagates its way through the system where the core user data may be gone. So that is an issue that's outstanding. I added a comment to it this morning. Unfortunately, my app is not showing me the numbers. And then there's another one which has to do with, should we separate transaction tokens from JWT? So this spec specifically is very much bound to JWT and OAuth and HTTP constructs. Should there be a way to define this in some more abstracty mechanisms to which we could have other bindings? Justin has this issue in the issues already, so either on the list or in the issue in GitHub, that's another topic. So those are sort of, I think, 4 things.
The
We've got 11
alternative,
minutes.
the motivation for an alternative format is performance, sort of a smaller size, or is it different features that are not available with a GWT?
So I think the issue is we're going to, Whimsy is one. People have been talking about, hey, could I do this in a more efficient way like protobufs? So, if I'm delivering a transaction token between multiple workloads, in Spiffy, maybe that could still be a job, but maybe it's something else. So,
but the issue, that question predated with Whimsy. So that's why I'm wondering.
Well, we knew it predated the Whimsy working group. It did not predate the Whimsy discussions like BOF.
I remember, but
yeah,
quick,
Dean,
Justin, and then we'll.
Do you mind if I jump queue just to hit this? So the initial motivation of me filing that issue was honestly more for just architectural cleanliness. This draft is doing a couple of different things all at the same time. There's a format and sort of there's a data model for the token, there's a syntactical format for the token, and there's a protocol for exchanging for that kind of token, and it's all rolled together. The initial question was, do these all need to be together? Because I think that that's a question that we, as a working group, need to ask ourselves in documents like this. Are we necessarily tying all these things together out of just convenience, or is there a reason to tightly thread this? Or do we need to explicitly build in some abstraction points? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a very important question that we need to ask when we see documents that combine format and protocol and data model all together like this. We've all seen them and seen them go both ways. Secondly, to George's point that, the conversations that led to Whimsy existing have been going on for quite a while now. And a large part of that has been and is currently, are there bits of this draft that can be reused or aligned with or abstracted from that make more sense in a Whimsy environment? Is it going to be like, are transaction tokens going to be an instance of this? Is a Whimsy token going to be an instance of a transaction token instead? Like, I don't think we know the answers yet. If you want to be speaking as Whimsy chair, if you want to be part of that design team that's going to go look into that answer, please reply to the Whimsy mailing list because we're looking for good people for that. George, I do hope you're going to be part of that conversation because I think that would be important. I think that there are a lot of important moving parts here that touch on things far outside of just OAuth and OAuth access tokens. And I think it's really important that we consider that as we're building this and as it sort of reaches out into the wider world. So I don't know exactly what those abstraction points are. Efficiency is very likely one of them, but that's far from a singular motivating factor. So Sorry for
Thank
the
you.
rambling answer.
Dean?
Hey, George. Dean Sachs. I just had one comment. Section 222, replacement transaction tokens, has a throwaway line as the last line that says, the transaction token service must exercise caution in what kinds of replacement requests it supports so as not to negate the entire value of transaction tokens. That feels really, really open-ended and very hand-wavy, but it's not addressed in the security considerations section. So
Okay.
I don't know what your plans are there. I don't know if you're looking for some help there, but there does seem to be some prior art in this space with, I believe macaroons are doing something similar to downscope. So I don't know if we can look at that as inspiration, but I'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Let's definitely clear up the text. I think, kind of the things, if you change the purpose of the transaction token in a replacement transaction token, what does that really mean from the integrity of the transaction as it's flowing through? Now, in Justin's conversations, in the identity chaining case where you're switching between one trust domain and a different trust domain, you may be required to change the purpose, but transaction tokens are within a single trust domain, so it shouldn't matter. So I think that was the intent of what that line, but I agree with you, it's very fuzzy, and we should be much more specific about what the processing rules are in the context of replacement transaction tokens. And to be quite honest, I would love to see on the list some real world examples for where we think replacement transaction tokens are highly valuable. Just because I think it will help add clarity for the kinds of processing rules that we would need to tighten up the spec.
Well, I think this is a place where we can be clear that the transaction token replacement should only downscope the scopes for the token and not increase the scoping of it. And so if we can map that out such that you can validate that it is only downscoping and never going the opposite direction, I think we can build some assurance into this protocol. But happy to help with that.
No, that'd be great. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks.
Cool. I think Rifat and I will ask for drop a mail to the WIMSI list or the WIMSI now formed WIMSI group to ask for some reviews. I think it sounds to me that this document would almost be a must read for anyone interested in WIMSI, or could be. So we may get some good reviews. In addition to that, I think the document now, several iterations in, I think it's in a much better shape than it was initially. And it's maybe a good time for some of you who haven't been involved in any of these discussions to take a look at the document. I think we need some more eyes.
Yep, definitely.
Any volunteers to give it a quick read? Yaron?
Yep.
Thank you.
You have
Perfect.
Brian in the queue there.
Oh, we have also Brian. Yeah.
Yeah,
Brian, go to the
Brian.
microphone. Anyone else? Yaron, and can I have a second one? Someone working? Joe, thank you, Joe. Okay.
Hey,
Brian.
I'm sorry, I just want to be a little pedantic about the header thing, because I've had to fight with it in other documents before. You do name a header in here to use to pass the token. And the point about registering is that you're not really supposed to do that without going through the formal process of registering the HTTP header, which turns out to be more than just naming it. So
right. So I think it's understood we have to go through the necessary process. Through the necessary process of doing that, and we hadn't got to that point yet. And I think there was some question: do we, as the working group, feel like it's necessary to define that mechanism for how we present them? Because if we don't need to define the mechanism of how we present them because it's internal to a trust domain, then we wouldn't have to go through that process. So that's why, right, that's why it was left there as fuzzy. But you're right, you're absolutely right. We need to do one or the other, and I think we were wanting to get some feedback from the working group as to what direction we should go.
I see, got it. It's sort of in that half state now that.
Yes,
and
it's totally in the half state now, known to be in the half state. So I wasn't clear about that. But it came up as a topic at 118. I was like, how do we present these? So we felt like we should put something in the spec. But yes, with the understanding that it's totally not correct for if we're going to define the header. So feedback on the list on that would be great.
Brian, you dropped?
I think it's a
Atul?
tool.
That's all, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the header, I feel like it'll be good to define it because that'll increase the interoperability. And I also wanted to get an opinion from the room about what that particular name that we have, the TXL-token as the header name. If you see that as a positive, neutral, there's some issues with that kind of thing.
Justin?
Yeah, just a little bit to echo Brian, since he and I both went through the process of defining just a couple of HTTP headers. How hard could it be? It's been a running joke for us for the past couple of years. It's really hard. So I would encourage the chairs to reach out to the HTTP directorate and ask for an early review, and perhaps engage in that with those folks to get feedback about where the appropriate place to put this would be. Once we have a direction. To me, there are two obvious places, the authorization header or a custom header. I don't know exactly which one makes the most sense.
Yeah.
I will give you a quick preview, though. They are going to tell you to use structured field values. And if you don't, you're going to have a real good reason not to, which you can do, but make sure you have that in hand before you go forward.
Thank you. From a deployment perspective, and people who have been, sort of deploying this as we're working on the spec, it actually turned out to be very valuable to separate this from the explicit authorization header, partly for migration purposes and partly for contexts where you may be using the authorization header for things like client authentication, which is separate from the token itself.
Right.
So that's sort of the reason, one of the reasons a separate header. And I will definitely take all the help from you guys, Atul and I, and Peter, in the sense of like, how do we structure that stuff to do it the right way?
Right. If that isn't made explicit in the draft, sort of the reasoning behind that, I would encourage you to add that, because that's a very helpful perspective.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We're out of time.
You are. Identity chaining.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Bergen here on behalf of my co-authors to talk a little bit about identity and authorization chaining across domains. Next slide.
You can use the clicker if you.
Oh, well.
You could try. Try. Did it work? Okay. Or not? Yeah. It's okay.
Okay, so this is a picture of a Tasmanian devil. A friend of mine was here last week on vacation. She sent me this picture. It may not be local, but none of my co-authors had a picture, and Taz was my favorite Looney Tune character. So here you go.
It's a rat.
A rat.
No, I'm just kidding.
Tasmanian devil. Oh, I hit the wrong.
What happens here?
All right. Oh, I'm holding it the wrong way. Okay, I get it now.
Okay.
All right. So today I'll talk about the challenge of identity chaining, what our approach is, what's in the draft, changes since last time, and next steps. And this was adopted as a working group item since last time. So I am going to go a little bit into the background, hopefully enough to get new people the idea without boring the people who have seen this before. All right, so in a situation where a client has obtained a token, an access token for a resource server, and that resource server may have multiple services inside it, and sometimes a service in that resource server may need to access a second resource server, and sometimes that second resource server may be in a second or different domain. It's not clicking anymore. Did I do something? Oh, well. Yeah, it's not working.
Yeah.
All right, and so the final service in this resource server may have some information that it would like to know in order to grant access to the client. Things like who was the resource owner, what authorization did they grant, what other entities were involved, and what authorization did they have. Next slide. And then we want to consider the situation where this second resource server is in an OAuth situation where there's an authorization server, and so there's going to be different authorization servers for each of the two resource servers. Next slide, please. All right, so here is what are going to propose. Next slide, please. So the solution uses two existing OAuth standards, token exchange and the assertion framework. So first, the client has a token for the resource server in domain 1. He needs to have a token for the resource server in domain 2. So he exchanges his access token with the authorization server in domain 1 to get an authorization grant for trust domain 2. Then the client uses that authorization grant in trust domain 2 to get an access token from the authorization server in trust domain 2, and then uses that access token to get the resource in trust domain 2. Next slide. So this is the generic picture of the solution. You see the client is just sort of floating above because we have two situations where one where the resource server acts as the client and one where the authorization server acts as the client. But generally speaking, the client is going to exchange the token to get an authorization grant, step 1, use that assertion grant to get an access token, step 2, and then present that access token in step 3 to the resource server in domain 2. Next slide, please. All right, so here's the first specific example of that where the resource server in domain 1 acts as the client. And so you see the foo service is going to get access to the second resource servers. Next slide. And then the other situation that we have, the use case, is when the authorization server in domain 1 acts as the client. And since it is an authorization server, there's some sort of a internal token exchange where it generates the authorization grant itself. Next slide, please. All right, so what's in the draft? Next slide. In the draft, we have specific steps for how to go through generically and specifically the steps of identity and authorization chaining. You see here the example generically. Next slide, please. This is the situation when the resource server is acting as the client. And you can see at the beginning, you may need to request the metadata. Next slide. And here's the one with the authorization server is acting as the client, and you can see it generates the authorization grant itself as part of the internal token exchange. Next slide. All right, so in the draft, we have a token exchange profile, and this has been updated since last time. You can see in the draft, we have that we should not use the requested token type parameter. We've got an issue to change that to relax or remove that should not, because there is a use case we have now where I think Aaron has one where he needs to use that. And so we're going to, like I said, either relax or remove that should not from there. Next slide. Also have a profile of the assertion flow. Nothing interesting there, so next slide. Claims transcription. So when there's going to need to be some sort of relationship between the authorization servers because, for example, the subject ID may be different in the two domains, and you need to be able to know how to transcribe the claims from one domain to another so that when the final resource server receives the token, it knows how to process it. Next slide. All right, so what's new? We've changed the name. Well, we've added authorization into the title. Before it was just identity chaining across trust domains. And so now it's identity and authorization chaining across domains to make it clear that we're not just doing identity chaining, but also propagating the authorization information throughout the tokens in the chaining. We've limited the authorization grant format to a JOT. More specific term, we've used now JOT authorization grant, and then some editorial stuff, renamed some section headers, moved use cases to the appendix, and some minor example fixes and editorial issues. Next slide, please. All right, and again, next slide. All right, so here are some open issues from GitHub. My TV is dead. I'm gonna have to stand out here to look and see. I'm not going to talk about all of these. There's just a few I want to hit.
Should I advance? Or?
Oh no, yeah.
It's an iChat, but
yep. So we want to add sender constraining mechanisms, DPOP, MTLS. This may be a big haul to get that in there, but I think it'll be important to get in. Oh, how does the AS know it should generate a JOT authorization grant? Is the audience value enough in the token to be exchanged for the authorization server to know that it needs to generate an authorization grant? And I guess those are the big ones that I wanted to talk about, and I think that's it for me. So if there's anything else you want to talk about, any other open issues that you'd like to address, we can talk about that. But that's all I wanted to cover, and this is the last slide. Any questions?
Yeah, any questions on this document? Aaron.
Yeah, hi, Aaron Paraki. I was curious about the sender constraining mechanism issue. Is there anything that needs to be done particularly uniquely for this versus just saying, by the way, you could use any of these sender constraining mechanisms to bind a token? Or is there something unique about the cross-domain aspect for that binding?
So I think there will be some challenges in the going across trust domains. For example, in MTLS, if you're going to propagate identity information and you've got the confirmation claim, how do you process that or propagate that if it's tied to a particular certificate? Things like that. How would you? I think it's important to talk about in the draft rather than saying you can do it, because I've been thinking about it for a while and I've had a challenge coming up with a good solution. So I'd like to see what other people could come up with.
Yeah, at the very least, I think it'd be useful to say, to mention sender constraining mechanisms. And then if there is anything that's particularly unique about what you have to do to use them for this, that's absolutely worth pointing out.
All right, thank you.
Brian.
I was just going to follow on and try to provide a little more color around that. There's a lot of different variations that, depending on who's calling who and chaining what, that makes sender constraining really, really difficult. There's some cases where it's not so much, but trying to capture all those and describe them in the doc, I think will be challenging. For instance, Aaron, like one of the canonical use cases here is where the original resource server receives an access token from the outside world and exchanges that access token for the authorization grant to go across domain. And in that case, if that original access token is sender constrained, it's actually sender constrained to the client outside. And so the resource server in that case is not in a position to present anything constraining it. So you have to sort of take it at its word there. But if it was switched, if that original client was making the exchange, then you could potentially constrain it. You can always constrain the issued token, but then that can get confused with the token that's being presented. In some cases, you can't do proof of possession. And for the authorization grant going cross domain, there's not actually a current defined way to send or constrain the authorization grant itself. So we might want to look at doing that too. But doing it in of itself isn't complicated, but the various flows and different ways that it can manifest itself adds complication, and talking about it in any sort of logical way is hard. As you can tell, as I try to talk about it, it gets really confusing.
Thanks, Brian. I think as you were talking, what struck me is I think we need to maybe write down the scenarios and then work through them one by one. To your point, sometimes it's going to be possible. In the cases where it is not, I think it'd be great for us to be explicit about why not. But maybe like a next thing to do here is just write down all the possible flows that we need sender constraining for.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. Which is the next one? So now I lost my, not sure which one was the next one. Okay.
There's only one.
Yeah.
The last one.
Perfect. That one. Aaron.
Great. Thanks. All right. So I'm back. Hi, Aaron Parecki. I want to talk about a new draft I've been working on, Identity Assertion Authorization Grant. Go ahead to the next slide. This is actually a profile of the draft we just heard about, the identity and authorization chaining across domains. So this was, it's a profile, although you might be somewhat surprised to hear that based on what I'm about to describe the use case for this as. Go to the next slide. So before we get into the draft, I want to talk about the context for this and the problem that I'm trying to solve with it. So in a enterprise deployment scenario, you might have this kind of relationship where a bunch of different applications made by different vendors all do single sign-on to the identity provider using OpenID Connect or SAML or whatever SSO protocol. And these applications are completely independent from each other. And we do SSO so that the user has a single account that they can use to get into all these different applications. Next slide. However, if we talk about what API access looks like between them, it's actually kind of a giant mess. So it's very common that these applications actually want to get data from each other. For example, your video conferencing software needing to talk to your calendar, or the wiki wants to embed content from other applications. And what we're left with is essentially requiring each of these applications to fend for themselves to figure out how to negotiate API access between them. And the identity provider isn't really part of any of that workflow at all. Next slide. One way this ends up actually reflecting on the user experience of these applications is you end up with like a wiki page like this, where you want to like embed content from these other applications that are tied in through SSO through the enterprise IDP. And you drop a link into the wiki page and it'll try to go and fetch a preview of that content. And what ends up happening right now is you have to go through this extra process of doing an OAuth flow from app to app. So in this case, this wiki software is saying, hey, in order to fetch this Slack conversation, we need you to actually connect your Slack account to this and go through an OAuth flow. Next slide. So from the user experience side, we end up with a lot of OAuth consent dialogues, which look wildly different between each other because they're all from different vendors. The scopes presented will be very different depending on the vendor. And it's just a lot of friction for no real purpose, because ultimately it's in the enterprise context, it's not even the user that needs to agree to that data sharing, because the enterprise has already agreed to the data sharing of that data. So that brings me to the identity assertion authorization grant. Next slide. So the goal of this draft is to take that single sign-on relationship that these different applications have and extend that relationship to broker API access between them. So next slide. It is, as we heard in the previous presentation, made up of two existing RFCs, token exchange and the JOT authorization grant. So this is made up of two of these building blocks. Token exchange is the first step, where you take this identity assertion, like an OpenID Connect ID token, or it could be a SAML assertion, do a token exchange flow to get a JOT out the other end, which is the represents the authorization of one app to get data from another app's API. Then take the JOT authorization grant and use RFC 7523 as a request for an access token, and then you get out a regular OAuth access token response at the other end. Next slide. So in this kind of deployment scenario, I forgot to draw the little circles that put it in the context of the previous drafts, what they call domain A and domain B. But you end up with the client software doing this token exchange back to the enterprise identity provider, getting that JOT, taking the JOT over to the resource server's authorization server to ask for an access token. Next slide. The reason that this works is because the sort of unstated thing here in the previous draft was that how does this authorization server in this domain know that it's okay to trust this JOT that came from somewhere else? Well, that's in this case because both of these applications do already have the single sign-on relationship to the same enterprise IDP. So it can use that same relationship as that trust root, so that it knows it can validate the JOT through that same signature. Okay, next slide. So why is this a profile, or why bother profiling? Why not just use the draft identity authorization training across domains? There's a couple of important points. In the authorization chaining draft, how the initial token is obtained is out of scope. It isn't really ever mentioned actually in the draft. It's kind of just assumed that the client has one already. And it's actually often implied that it's an access token. In this, it's implied but not required, because it's actually just using the token exchange framework, which can take in a bunch of different kinds of tokens. In the identity assertion draft, that initial token is explicitly a token that is obtained through a single sign-on flow. And then similar to that, the input to the token exchange in the identity chaining draft is generic or flexible. It's basically just saying, hey, go use token exchange, and any of the token types that token exchange talks about can be used here. In the identity assertion draft, it is explicitly only identity tokens that are accepted. So only ID tokens and SAML assertions, not access tokens, not refresh tokens. Third, in the identity chaining draft, there is a brief mention about how this trust relationship needs to exist in order for this to work, but it's left out of scope of that draft. In the identity assertion draft, that cross-domain trust relationship is explicitly because both have that connection for SSO to the identity provider. And then lastly, in the identity chaining draft, the actual JOT that is used as the cross-domain thing, the thing that's the output of token exchange and input to the authorization grant, there's nothing additional defined beyond just a JOT in the identity chaining draft. And in the identity assertion draft, there's a very explicit list of requiring certain claims and actually defining the semantics of certain claims things like this needs to be the what's going on? Can you things like the audience needs to be this certain thing, or we need this client ID claim because of this reason. So why profile? Essentially because the identity chaining draft enables this use case, but is too open, too vague. And in order to actually get proper interop between all the parties participating in this use case, we do need to lock down a lot of those options and narrow the scope of it. So this is meant to be a interoperable profile for this particular use case, where someone who wants to do this can read this draft and actually end up with something that works with the rest of what people have built. Next slide. I think I have a couple slides in here that just quickly go through the requests and responses. I don't want to go too deep into this, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like. This first request is the token exchange request, taking an ID token as the subject token for the token exchange, saying, hey, we need to get this requested token type is this identity JOT authorization grant for this resource, which is this token endpoint over at this other application. And at the bottom, I put in a client assertion or a JOT, private key JOT authentication, client authentication, just for good measure. You can see we can also request different scopes for this application as well. Next slide. The response to this is a token exchange response, which means weirdly we have to have the token type of NA, which is, I guess, some sort of legacy thing, and the parameter access token also weirdly, as mentioned in the token exchange draft, isn't actually an access token. It's just a thing that has to be called access token for reasons. That token is the JOT authorization grant that will be used in the next step, but the issued token type is the thing that actually says what that is. And then similar to how if a client requests certain scopes, the response can say, yes, you got all those scopes, or actually you only got a subset of those scopes based on policy. Next slide. So the next step would be the client takes this JOT assertion over to the other application, the token endpoint at the other authorization server, and says, hey, I need an access token. So this would just be like a regular OAuth access token request, except now it's using a JOT bearer with the assertion being that JOT. The claims in the JOT will describe, and the JOT type will describe what this is to give it the appropriate ways to switch over to this flow. It can validate the signature based on the issuer claim in the JOT, things like that. And next slide. The response is a regular OAuth token response. Next slide. Yeah, so the other important thing here is that because of how we expect people to deploy this, we wanted to make sure that we are not imposing any new restrictions on the actual access token that's at the end result of this, because we're assuming people already have an OAuth framework because they are currently doing OAuth to other applications and issuing tokens of whatever format they've decided is appropriate. So this is just same token response that you would already be sending for like an auth code flow, and not making any new requirements on access token type or format or anything like that. Next slide. So the status of this work, this is currently implemented in a development branch at Okta. It is deployed for live testing. We have demo apps built that do both sides of this. There's a little sample wiki application. There's a sample to-do list application. They can go through this whole sequence to do the exchange and get API access across the different across these domains. And we are working with two companies who are also planning on implementations of this as well, and we're just starting that work now as well. So that is the presentation. Happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Anything? Did people see similar sort of needs or have some comments or questions on the content that Aaron presented? want to review this work, find it interesting? George.
George Fletcher. Aaron, so it sounds like basically we're bootstrapping off the ID token to identify the authenticated session and then creating basically the authorized access token off of that identity, right, in the sense of accessing APIs. It gets a little bit, I think, to maybe someone else's comment here this morning about, like, do we need to add sender constraining in certain places around the ID JAG token that's issued, and I'm thinking mostly about, is there an impersonation scenario if I get access to the ID token that would then allow me, using this mechanism, to get, access tokens to other things?
Sure. Yeah, I can speak to that really quick. Can you go to slide 10? I think that's going to be the most useful picture for this.
This one?
Yeah, thanks. So there's a couple of assumptions made here which are spelled out in the draft, which is that there are actually OAuth clients. There's an OAuth client registered between the two applications at the bottom, which today is used for a OAuth redirect flow, which means that JWT authorization grant request can use the same client authentication and same sender constraining mechanisms if they want to. So all that is possible to do without really any new work. And then similarly, the client that's doing the token exchange to the enterprise IDP, it already has a registered client there with, again, its own client credentials or sender constraining mechanism. So again, we can use the same sender constraining that exists there. And I obviously would recommend doing that if possible. So I would absolutely be up for adding a mention of, hey, here's how to do sender constraining with this, but I don't think anything new needs to be defined. And I think it's actually pretty straightforward to make it work in this scenario based on the relationships between the parties here. Is there any questions on that before I get to the second part of your question?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Maybe we just add something in security considerations.
I think a sender constraining section would be useful beyond security considerations. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. As for the impersonation question, again, because there's existing client relationships between all three legs of this relationship, that information about which client's which is meant to be embedded in the JWT authorization grant. And then similarly, like if you just grab an ID token from somewhere, you can't go and do a token exchange with that because you would need to include the client authentication of the client that ID token was issued to in order to use the token. So it's not just an arbitrary ID token in, authorization out. It's ID token plus client authentication in, and now you can't just go stealing ID tokens. So I think it's all covered under this, but it relies on that fact that there are registered clients between all three parties here.
Great, thanks.
Okay, Atul.
Yeah, hi, Atul Tilchibagwale. So I think this is really useful and definitely something that needs to be done. I just sort of was wondering if this can be done as a profile of the ID chaining spec rather than a separate spec. And if you look at slide 11, everything you talked about seems to be kind of a specialization of ID chaining. And so just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I'm not sure what you mean. So this is meant to be a profile of the identity chaining draft.
I thought the specific mechanisms that you were doing were somewhat different from what we're doing in ID chaining, or is that sort of just...
it's so a little bit of background on this. When I started this work, I started with something that actually did work quite differently and things were called different things, and then realized that actually it is in fact the exact mechanism you're describing in identity chaining. So I reworked the whole thing to actually literally use the identity chaining draft as the base. So if you were to implement this draft, and it is 100% within the framework of the identity chaining draft. Like there is nothing new added in it. It's just a restriction and profiling and some additional requirements of what the parameters mean. But it is 100% a profile of the identity chaining draft.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. I think we may actually see additional profiles. So keeping it as a separate document makes sense. So that I could foresee a whole, not a family, but maybe 2, 3 more as we need to tie down to specific use cases. So I wouldn't want to try and compress that into one document.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Cool.
I wasn't suggesting making it one document. So just to be clear. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make this work fit within the identity chaining draft. So and was able to do that.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So since we still have a little bit of time left, I wanted to come back to the open questions during
Sorry.
Brian's presentation. Rifat, go ahead.
Yeah. Christina has a comment about the name of the document. Christina, do you want to talk about this here, or do you want
I don't have much to add other than, yeah, the naming of the drafts was slightly confusing to me. Like, I understand the rationale of like intention of both, but just looking at the naming, I mean, I understand the background, Aaron, that you started separately, but maybe aligning it somewhat would be clear.
This is a tough. Naming is hard. Let's just say
Right.
that. So in the time in the time between the last meeting and now, what you didn't see was a whole discussion about the naming of both the identity chaining draft and this draft. The identity chaining draft started as just identity chaining, and then we added authorization to it. I think that was mentioned in the last session. So the draft is now identity and authorization chaining, which that was meant to sort of make it more clear that it is possible to profile it for authorization use cases. And then the reason I chose this name for mine is it's 2 parts. It's the identity assertion is the input, and then the authorization grant is the name that is from 7523 of the JOT authorization grant. So it's in my mind, these are already kind of connected, but I see how maybe it's not obvious, but I don't at this point have any better suggestions for how to make that more clear.
Atul.
Hi, Atul Tulshibakole. So sorry, I mean, if can this work also with SAML? Like, I know. Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure it's not tightly bound to OIDC.
No, it's not. It's in the example, I only have an ID token example in the spec, but it does mention that SAML assertions are a valid input, and because token exchange allows SAML tokens as input, it's fine to do that as well.
Hi, Justin
Great.
Richard. I think I've.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Go ahead.
No worries. I think this is just me probably losing the thread here, but I got the impression from the last presentation that it was JOT only as input. And so hearing that this subset profile, is it? Or am I misunderstanding?
No, slightly misunderstanding. The JOT only, the JOT only part of the previous in the previous mention was actually the assertion, the output of token exchange, and the input to.
Okay, so the intermediary piece is JOT only. Right, exactly. Okay, thank you. That clears up a lot.
And that was actually an alignment that we did between these 2 drafts over the last couple of months as well.
Okay, so we finished this one. Perfect.
What are my next steps for working group adoption of this?
I think we let this cook a little bit. The other document is also sort of like the identity chaining is just getting into a phase where we say it's a little bit more mature. We would expect more reviews to come in, and like if you find people who are interested outside Okta, who also sort of would be interested in this, I think that could be a good indication that we should sort of then run a call for adoption. Does that sound
Great.
good?
Yeah, I have
It's a
2 already,
version.
so
Yeah.
I will. I have 2 interested parties already, so I'll hopefully be able to report more in July.
Cool. We have still 15 minutes left, so I think we should sort of jump back to Brian's presentation, and if those who had these questions still remember what the questions were, we should discuss them. We should use the time we have efficiently. Brian, do you want to come over here and moderate those?
Do you want your slides back?
Happy to. I don't know. I apologize for running long earlier. And if there are
perfect.
questions and we can talk about them now, I'm happy to do so. But if the context has been lost, I can sit down too.
I think it might be nice to kind of maybe go to the last slide where we're focusing on a few open issues. Before that.
Not that far.
This one?
Is this the only one we had? I think you had like a slide with Richard. Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Mike.
Mike Jones, I read the PR and commented on it, but in my mind, an SDJOT that does or does not include key binding is still an SDJOT and not a different data type. I would not use a different media type. I would not sort of divide the world unnecessarily. It's just an optional feature that you use or not.
Richard,
you want to respond to that?
you
Richard?
sneaked on to Mike.
The concern here is that yes, in some degree it's an optional feature. You could, but it's something that it gives you different security properties out of the object. If I hand you an SDJOT without key binding, you have no idea whether I have the private key that goes with it or not. I just chose some things to disclose to you, and I could be replaying it from something I got from someone else. But if I hand you one with key binding, you have proof that I have the private key. And so we just need to make sure that whoever's verifying that knows which properties they're getting.
But Richard, wouldn't the different media type really help? Because if I'm making that attack, I would just also change as well the media type. And so, like, it sounds a little bit like this is attack that is very similar to what was presented at the last IETF meeting in LAMS, where if you do make changes to that algorithm, then you could do some downgrade and potentially then mount some attacks. And the solution that was discussed there in LAMS was, well, couldn't we actually incorporate something into the key derivation of a procedure? So obviously that was on encryption, so we would have to adjust that appropriately. But something along those lines that relate to the use of the cryptographic mechanisms, or to punt it on, discuss the issue and punt it on additional data that needs to be negotiated outside the use of the mechanism. So what I'm thinking about here is, if I'm in a specific environment, if I'm saying I'm using a token with a key associated with it, I need to sort of indicate that somehow in the policy, like I would indicate that I only accept certain algorithms. I don't accept anything. So something along those lines.
This is why basically the state of it now. And I think Richard's assertion is not actually changing any of that, but just restructuring the terminology so that it's more clear which object we're talking about and lessen the opportunity for mistakes around that policy to come up.
Precisely.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
a security.
clearly, if you
It's a-
arrange your policy, much like with Algnon, like that's why I bring this up as the analogy. If with Algnon, if you arrange your policy about what algorithms are acceptable, you will not be vulnerable to this. But what we found in practice, in operation, is people don't arrange their policies correctly, and we end up with vulnerabilities as a result. So the idea of creating a clearer separation here is to make it more difficult and discourage people from arranging their software in ways that you have to very precisely arrange a policy to distinguish the two cases, but instead encourage people to treat these cases very separately so that they're difficult to confuse.
Hannes said some of what I was going to say in response. To Brian's point, it is not just terminology. There's a different media type, which in my mind is extraneous. And Hannes explained why it's extraneous, because the very fact that you claim that something uses the different media type and you claim that it has a key binding doesn't mean that it does. The recipient still has to verify that there's a key binding. So the different media type doesn't actually help with security properties at all. So I would not do that. I said that in my PR comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
John Bradley. So the SDJWT has a confirmation method that the receiver has to verify. I mean, that's in the signed object. That's the issuer is putting it in there. So that's what drives whether or not it's a key bound SDJWT. Well, maybe I misunderstand, but if there's a confirmation method, you're supposed to check the confirmation method, otherwise it's an error. So I don't know that the media type actually helps with the validation. Perhaps it helps with the requesting.
Yeah, the media type's not at all intended to help with the validation. It's there as a tool to do things that people might want to do, like request something,
Right,
indicate that it is, but it's not a security measure.
I think there's perhaps a stronger argument for if you need to request if you want to request one or the other, having a media type might help you with that. I think it's dangerous to infer that the media type actually conflates with the confirmation method in the JWT.
I mean, just to be clear, we should never have an interface into which you can shove an SDJOT without key binding or an SDJOT with key binding, because those things are going to give you different properties and they should be handled differently. Right? So like we should guide against any designs at the protocol level or at the API level or whatever that encourage you to just shove something in without regard to whether it has key binding or not. That's my point here. That's the point of all of this submit to terminology and media type distinction, is to guide toward designs that treat these things separately because they have different security properties.
John, you don't look convinced. Microphone. Go to the microphone if you. Microphone.
And for what it's worth, the confirmation claim, that's not the only way to express key binding within it, and is not intended to be the sole driver of whether or not key binding needs to be checked in the verifier. We've even had folks like Neil previously argue that there needs to be the ability to accept either based on policy, allow for upgrades and so forth. So it's not, the idea is that it has to be bound to policy about whether you will accept or not
Right.
one of these with or without key binding, and that has to be it. And simply talking about them as different things helps describe APIs, define APIs, and talk about them as such. There's no actual, maybe we're talking past
So
each other.
talking about them as different things is different from necessarily having a different media type for them. So I agree that talking about them as different things makes sense. I mean, right, the common thing that these things are going to be used for is to carry some sort of verifiable credential to a verifier in a three-party model.
Yep.
And the response is going to have an SDJWT. In some cases, they're going, if it's a PID, it's going to have a key binding because that's the law. And in other cases, if it's a gym membership, maybe not so much. But they're both going to be received over the same flow by a verifier. And the verifier doesn't know a priori which it's going to get. Well, maybe it needs to, but in the current designs of verifiable credentials, it doesn't.
That's
So-
downstream error.
Well,
Microphone.
right, but that we have the browser vendors designing APIs which prevent the verifier from being able to know those sorts of things. So there are a couple of things pulling this in different directions. They have, I think you've been on some of those calls, but there are privacy issues which people wanting to blind different things, which may stop that stuff from being known a priori. So I agree with you at a high level. I'm just not certain. Trying to completely separate those at the verifier probably means looking at other parts of the protocol flow.
Okay, Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, so I didn't want the discussion to solely focus on the media types because that's not the only thing this PR does. So to kind of break it down, the first part is clarity. Honestly, against the editor's intuition, this split between a state jot and a state jot with key binding jot made the draft pretty much clear, like easier to read conceptually and stuff. Like we've been struggling with terminology. So that's kind of the first starting point. The second point is I do agree with Richard's point that it is very beneficial to separate these two concepts from the processing perspective. And I'm not sure I entirely agree with what John said. Like these two things, Verifier needs to distinguish. And whether there's a browser API or OpenID or whatever protocol, like Verifier honestly needs to know how it's processing what it's receiving, whether it's from the browser API or whatnot, right? And the media type for SDJOT with key binding JOT just becomes one of the means that can be used to differentiate. But we're not saying that's like the only or the way to differentiate. So I think, at least for the purpose of this discussion, if we can get an agreement that differentiating these two is DJOT with and without key binding, especially from the verifier perspective, and honestly from the wallet's perspective too, because wallet needs to know, yeah, if it's sending a is DJOT with key binding or without. Like if we can agree that that's beneficial, like that would help.
Okay. Thanks, Christina. Cho. Actually, and we are running out of time, but Cho, still continue.
Just real quickly, Joe Salloway. For me, I think being able to differentiate between these two things makes it clearer how you would apply policy to it. Now, I may be missing some of the nuances here, but it seems like a good idea.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks, Joe.
Mike.
Yeah, to Christina's point, I'm fine with editorial clarity. I am not fine with making protocol distinctions among things that you're going to have to verify as a recipient anyway. If you have a different media type, you're still going to have to check whether it conforms to the media type regardless. So you're going to do the work if you have a secure implementation. So don't add artificial syntactic sugar that doesn't help. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just quickly say, why do we need why do we have explicit JOT typing then? Like when you get a JOT, you know that different JOTs are different, but you still want a TYP to know what you are exactly getting. I see this as a parallel.
It is parallel, but I draw a different lesson from that. The type value for explicit typing is part of the sign structure and so can't be changed. But the recipient only gets value from that by checking it at runtime when it receives it. Just like you only get key binding value by checking it at runtime whether you received a key binding as part of the signed data structure. So Christina's right, it's exactly parallel. The recipient must check it regardless or it has no value.
And this is just naming to try to encourage that and try to avoid mistakes around that. The media type itself is ancillary and just there as a means to express that that's what this is in context that need it, but isn't required for any of the security or processing. It's sort of orthogonal to the core at hand. It just seemed worthwhile to add a media type.
We ran out of
Yeah,
time,
so
unfortunately, on that.
the specific example, the jar RFC uses the same value as a TYP in the JOT and as a media type. Like we already have a precedent doing this.
Guys,
This is a little different.
wait, this is super interesting. I hope we have some spare time at the next two sessions and we can continue that conversation. Would like to hear the outcome or any directions forward on this topic. But for today, we are done. I would like to thank you all for the contributions, the speakers for their nice slides. And I think we've managed to find some reviewers and yeah, go from there. Thank you all. Thank you. A big thanks to the online participants.
And to Justin for taking the notes.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Or hopefully you took the notes. Bye, Rifat.
Bye, guys. Enjoy the weather.
I'll take your cup.